Ladies and gentlemen, welcome on this beautiful Melbourne night. I would like to begin the evening in our customary way by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which this event takes place. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the 2016 Fonenda Lecture at the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Business and Economics. I'm Professor Paul Kaufman, Dean of the Faculty. Tonight marks the 30th Fonenda Lecture. Commencing in 1986, the Fonenda Lecture was established in memory of Orwell D. Fonenda, a former academic at the University of Melbourne, who was one of the leading figures in industrial relations scholarship in the early 20th century. Each year, we invite a distinguished figure from government, business, the union movement, or academia to present a lecture on contemporary issues in industrial relations and human resource management. This is a once-in-a-lifetime honor. Speakers cannot be invited to deliver more than just a single Orwell Fonenda lecture. It is appropriate, therefore, to make some brief remarks about the man himself, Mr. Orwell Fonenda, in whose honor this lecture series is named. Orwell de Ruyter Fonenda was born in 1890, and in 1909 he became Melbourne. He joined the newly established Faculty of Commerce in 1926 as part-time lecturer, and by 1954 was appointed the head of the then brand new established Department of Industrial Relations. He was the first head of an industrial relations department at an Australian university. Orwell retired from full-time teaching in 1957. But continued on a part-time basis to his retirement in 1969. His research was focused on the federal system of conciliation and arbitration. His primary focus was on the economic and protective functions of the federal tribunal. Fonenda was interested in the role of industrial tribunals to deal with social problems and the role of unions as agents of change. Fonenda passed away in 1985, and we commenced this lecture series a year later, funded by a trust set up by his family. The faculty is delighted to continue honoring Orwell Fonenda's achievements through this named lecture series. I would now like to invite my colleague, Professor Prakash Singh, head of the Department of Management and Marketing, to introduce our speaker for the 2016 Fonenda Lecture.
Thank you, Paul. The department is delighted that the 2016 Fonenda Lecture will be delivered by Mr. Garry Weaven. Garry is Chair of IFM Investors, a global funds management business collectively owned by Australian industry superannuation funds and now serving some 200 institutional investors worldwide. His highly diversified career has included a period as a foundation member on the boards of Melbourne Docklands Authority and Infrastructure Australia. As ACTU Assistant Secretary in the 1980s, Garry played a seminal role in the development of the industry superannuation fund movement and was the founding chair of a number of today's leading funds before leaving the ACTU to take on a range of consultancies in the early 1990s. Garry is a member of the Board Investment Committee and the Board Remuneration and People Committee. He was also prominent in the campaigns for shorter working hours in a number of sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Garry Weaven.
Thank you, Prakash. So I've slightly tweaked the title as it appeared in the advertising blurb. I'm now calling it, and in the version that you'll be able to get access to afterwards, I'm calling it Workers' Capital, the story of industry funds and Australia's superannuation revolution, because I thought on reflection, having completed this piece, that it has been something of a revolution, and we should acknowledge that in the title. So as this chart behind you shows, from a base of around 40 billion only in the early 80s in terms of total assets in superannuation, that pool has grown today to 2.1 trillion. It's probably more, but with the markets the way they are, I'm never quite sure. So, but it's at least that figure. And I think on my back of the envelope calculation, unless someone takes to it with a political hatchet, it'll be about 6 trillion by the end of the 2020s. And so to put that in context, the reason for that chart is to put that in context compared to the GDP and compared to the total market capitalisation of all of the companies on the Australian Stock Exchange. So you can see that it's already left them a little bit behind, and in the next decade or so will leave those numbers completely behind, barring political attack. But moreover, I think the system has been transformed from what was, back in the 80s, a tax-driven perquisite, really, for senior company executives to retain the services of senior company executives and to reward long-serving and white-collar public servants. I make that point because it wasn't good for all public servants. It was good if you stayed for a long time and you were a white-collar public servant. But it's moved from that to a more or less universal system, a part of a universal retirement income system, a second pillar, if you like, after the aged pension. And it's based these days on fully vested rights. That is, the money is collected in the name and owned by the individual members of the community and the funds. And there is more or less full portability between jobs and into retirement. And that is a fundamental change to what what was before us in the 80s. In international circles, I'm often asked how it was that this could come about, that it's not just the scale of the system, but also the fact that some 40% of the total assets of the system, and indeed the best performing part of the assets of the system, are actually managed under the representative trustee model. So the US unions, for example, in particular US unions, and the so-called Taft-Hartley funds, which are somewhat like industry funds in North America, those organisations in particular are often quite fascinated by the extent to which the representative trustee system, through the agency of industry super funds, has come to be central not only to our superannuation system, but indeed to the whole process now of capital formation in this country. No doubt those people are hopeful that they might glean some insight that could assist them in the reform of their own disastrously inadequate system. But invariably I have to disappoint those people, because the truth is that the opportunity for reform in Australia arose from the confluence of our what was then a unique industrial relations system of conciliation and arbitration, and with a very particular set of industrial, economic, political and social circumstances. The industrial relations legal framework, for a start, was clearly a very powerful factor in facilitating growth in nominal wages of those with little bargaining power, and that in turn enabled those with more bargaining power to advance their wages and then feed back again to those with less bargaining power. And that was so for two main reasons, in my opinion. Firstly, the Act truly embedded unions in the process of wage fixation, as distinct from the US labour law environment, whose focus really was and is much more on the qualified right to organise and the qualified right to bargain, rather than actually embedding unions in any way in intervening in the wage fixing process. So quite a different fundamental legislative framework. And secondly, the Australian system at that time actually, and together with the precedents created by the Conciliation and Arbitration Commission or Industrial Relations Commission, proclaimed the desirability of uniformity of pay and conditions for similar work, giving rise to the principle of comparative wage justice in those days. So in short, the system created both the possibility and the eventuality that unions could, from time to time, generate a pace of advancement in money wages that would result in price inflation, often at a rate well above that of our trading partners. And this was regarded by most economic commentators, was regarded as a serious threat to continued real growth in economic growth and employment, for that matter. So that this chart can show you that at times there were some fairly extreme levels of movement in wages and prices, and quite strong linkage, a very obvious strong linkage. In that chart covers the period, if you can't see it, it covers the period 1970 to 1985. So then another important circumstantial event was the election in 1983 of a Labor government, and not just any Labor government. This was a government led by the former president of the ACTU, Bob Hawke. And that government and he and his team were committed to addressing the fundamental economic problems of the nation, but to addressing them in a way that involved dialogue with the union movement and with employer associations, dialogue rather than the hard fist of legislation or punitive actions. In other words, he was committed to the so-called Accords. A third particular circumstance of the early 1980s in Australia was the existence of militant and powerful unions in the building and construction industry. The BLF, the Builders Labourers Federation, the BWIU, the Plumbers Union, amongst others, were each in their own way quite left-wing and militant, and individually and collectively quite capable of driving substantial gains in terms of wages and conditions, both on a site-by-site basis and on an industry-wide basis. A further particular circumstance was important in setting in train the events that would lead to the most momentous union campaigns in Australia's history, or one of them at least. And this was the fact that the previous federal Liberal government had initiated federal court proceedings seeking the deregistration of the Builders Labourers Federation, the BLF. So there was considerable conflict in all of these years and leading up to these years, involving demarcation disputes and leapfrogging wage claims between the BLF and the BWIU in particular. But notwithstanding that, all of the unions were quite steadfast still at that time in their opposition to the precedent of union deregistration. And in any case, it's doubtful whether deregistration of the BLF could have created any abatement of industrial disruption unless the other unions cooperated by taking over their work and their membership, in effect. So the government, the newly elected Labor government, clearly needed a reason, or if you like, a pretext, for withdrawing from the deregistration proceedings in the court. And the only credible pretext would be the brokering of an enduring pact between all the unions and the major employers. So accordingly, in the early part of 1983, a working group was formed with government blessing under the chairmanship of former Conciliation and Arbitration Commissioner Alan Vosty to attempt to reach a national agreement for the building industry that would guarantee a significant reduction in industrial disruption. And for perhaps the first time in their history, the building unions agreed to work together under the auspices of the ACTU to attempt to reach a single national agreement. And the then ACTU Secretary, Bill Keldy, assigned me the task of attempting to coordinate them. I don't know why, but I think it was because my previous assignment was with the Painters and Dockers Union. So, Lucky Garry, they called me. So, the employers in this exercise, the employers were represented by the NICC, I think that stood for National Industrial Construction Council or something very like that. And all of the unions party to the National Building Industry Award were involved in those negotiations, as well as the ACTU. So unions include the BWIU, the BLF, the Carpenters and Joiners, the Operative Painters and Decorators Union, and the Plumbers. And the narrow sort of trade-based unions at that time generally feared the power and industry-wide ambitions of the BWIU. They wanted their craft union, if you like. They feared the industry-wide approach of the BWIU, which drove them to often support politically the BLF, even though they were not always very happy with some of the BLF's behaviour. The claims, the log of claims really that the unions and the ACTU collectively had developed, as was customary, was heavily weighted toward wages and allowances increases and the right to pursue further gains on the issue of working hours. And this was a period where quite a lot of movement in shorter working hours was achieved in the 80s. The issue of superannuation was included, but I think it was item number 25. It was well down the list and would not normally have surfaced in the negotiations. Employers, for their part, were preoccupied with two issues. The first was getting rid of so-called homers. Only a few people will even recognise what that could have possibly meant. What it actually meant was that the building unions were developing a habit of striking for the day, walking off the job in pursuit of one claim or another. Sometimes very important things like safety issues, others more venal issues, but walking off the job in support of a particular claim and then refusing to come back to work until they were paid for the time that they were on strike. And this was pretty insidious, as you'd expect, and caused a great amount of fear for what could develop amongst the employers of the day. So that was a big concern, that they wanted to get rid of that practice. And the other thing they were really focused on was that any settlement they made needed to be encapsulated entirely, ratified by the Arbitration Commission and captured inside the award, because in that way they could pass on the cost to their clients, which were basically institutions, institutional investors and others. So they needed to be able to pass, under the building contract standard arrangements, needed to be pass those costs on, and really would have difficulty in doing that unless those terms and conditions were embedded in an official award. That's still highly relevant today, of course, too. There was effectively, I suppose, because of the Accord negotiations and the Commission guidelines and Commission concern to keep a lid on inflation, there was effectively a level of wage increase that could, a ceiling, there was a ceiling really on the level of wage increase that could be consistent with that arrangement. The objective of the latter was clearly that some cap would be put on the rate of growth of the nominal value of wages, and therefore their impact on the national rate of inflation, in return for measures which would be beneficial to workers and their families, the so-called social wage issues, which came to involve, and did at the time involve, things like Medicare and things like family allowances, and ultimately, as we shall see, superannuation. So the ceiling wasn't always precise, but it was heavily influenced by what the metal industry metal manufacturing industry could sustain, because that award was very influential in those days. Manufacturing, where is it now? But anyway, it was very influential in those days in terms of flow-on effect to the rest of the economy. So in the upshot, after months of bargaining, this was through 1983, remember, months of bargaining, and as much persuasion as the ACTU could bring to bear on all of the parties, the gap between what could reasonably be argued before the full bench of the Arbitration Commission and the price which the militancy and bargaining position of the building unions could extract from employers came down to a mere $7 per week. And Chairman Vosti proposed that he could recommend that amount, $7, be applied as a special building industry recovery procedures allowance. Became known as a burp allowance, by the way, in its brief life. It never saw the light of day. But he could do that provided all the parties agreed and the unions were genuinely committed to certain measures calculated to reduce industrial disruption to the industry. And so it was agreed. Certainly, given the intractability of Norm Gallagher, I don't know if anyone here knew him, but a difficult character and definitely stubborn, a strong guy, but his intractability, independence of his union, and often with the support from the plumbers, and then the unwillingness of the BWIU to let the BLF get one up on them, there was really no prospect of accepting anything less than that arrangement, and so it was agreed to take that to the full bench. It was, as I said, a monumental and unprecedented negotiation to bring the unions together. Anyway, a short time later, Bill Kelty called me to his office and he told me that he didn't believe that the Commission would ratify the so-called burp allowance, or indeed the agreement. And that would mean that the whole deal, of course, would fall apart. And he'd clearly come to that view, and I think perhaps had been actually told, I'm not entirely sure of this, but I think had been actually told by Laurie Carmichael, the head of the Metal Workers Union, that the amount, if approved, would then be claimed by every other union, by the metal workers and every other union, and would flow into the whole round, the wage round, and be part then of the inflationary round again. And that would be an embarrassment to the government as well as to the Commission. Years later, I might say, Bill did disclose publicly that he'd actually had private discussions with a member of that bench, Deputy President Ludique, to seek to ensure that the $7 didn't get approved as part of the package. It was quite momentous at the time, and perhaps that's why he didn't tell me at the time, but anyway, as things have turned out, it was actually a great call, I think, as things have turned out. So he asked me, though, that if he thought we could get agreement to convert the burp component into a claim for employer-funded superannuation. As we talked about, Bill and I had talked in particular, had talked about super as an industrial issue for a long time, for many years, on and off. I'd come from a white-collar union background, the Municipal Officers Association, and so I'd already been involved in a whole range of negotiations and campaigns with Victorian local authorities and state government authorities over the issue of superannuation. Indeed, I was still a serving member at that time of the local government, local authorities super board. And in the absence really of any effective action at all by federal governments, either Labor or Liberal governments, I mean, we all had policy, but there was no action of any effective sort coming from the federal government on the issue. Because of that, the ACTU, under the leadership of Bob Hawke, who'd gone by the time I'm talking about now, he'd gone into Parliament, as I said, he'd become Prime Minister. But when he was President, he'd gone so far as to establish an in-house super fund in the ACTU with the idea that it might be a focus for future union claims. But it had failed by this time, after several years, had failed to do much more than become a vehicle for super benefits for a handful of union staff. That was the truth of it. In any case, I had to tell Bill that I didn't believe it would be possible to change the agreement, and that was for a number of reasons. Firstly, all parties and the chairman, Vosti, had committed to take the agreement to the full bench for ratification. The employers would surely oppose super as an industrial issue, because that was sacred law, that super wasn't an industrial issue and must be opposed at all costs, almost as a class issue, really, I have to say. Must be opposed at all costs. And as I previously said, the employers insisted that all monetary costs go into the award, whereas the Commission had insisted that super could not be an industrial matter under the Act, could not be an industrial matter for the purpose of the Industrial Relations Act. And they cited, in support of that, a High Court case called the Hamilton-Knight case. And I'll mention the Hamilton-Knight case again in a few moments. In addition, the BLF would have been absolutely certain to use that as an excuse to break away from the agreement and pursue their own ends. They were always really looking to break the shackles of any collective agreement which restrained them in any way. However, Kelty subsequently approached the BWIU National Secretary, Pat Clancy, and his Assistant Secretary, Tom McDonald. And Pat Clancy, at that time, was going blind and was transferring power gradually to Tom. As a result of that meeting, Tom, and I'd worked very closely with Tom during the course of that year's negotiations, he came back to me and he said, "We've been persuaded. If the allowance gets knocked off, but we can get the Commission to approve the rest of the package, then we will support it and all the measures that go with it, provided that the ACTU then leads a campaign for industrial superannuation for the building industry." So that was agreed as a strategy to try and settle the matter. When the bench subsequently rejected the allowance, the BLF immediately launched a wage claim for $9 a week, not $7, for $9 a week, and went out with some sort of a campaign in the field in pursuit of their $9 claim, and accused us of really some sort of skullduggery in suggesting that we should substitute super. And you can understand their point of view, but it wasn't very progressive. But nevertheless, you can understand it. So the BWIU's response obviously was, well, whatever we do, the claim for super has to be more than $9. So I'd already drafted a proposal, an outline for a scheme that would cover a model scheme that would cover the industry, that would involve a flat weekly payment, and then would take $1 or something like that for administration and reserves on top, and then would take $1 for a basic death cover, a basic life cover. There was no life insurance at all anywhere in hardly any industry. And so Tom said, well, that's fine, let's make the claim $11. And that's why $9 in the member's account, $1 for admin and reserves, and $1 for insurance. And that's how the first claim came about. And that's fundamental to the idea of the first 3% ever awarded by the Commission and inserted in awards. In any case, the other unions, except for the BLF, the other unions were persuaded by us to fall in behind that claim and pursue it on a site basis. The employer organisations, of course, remained implacably opposed to it. So it meant stoppages and so on throughout the building industry. I drew up a request for a proposal. I remember we issued it in December 1983. We sent a proposal around to all the major life companies and superannuation providers. They must have wondered what had struck them when it landed on their desk, signed by me. I think I wasn't Assistant Secretary, I was Senior Industrial Officer of the ACTU. But anyway, they must have wondered what the hell had struck them. But we did get competitive responses from a number of them, in particular from Colonial Mutual, National Mutual and AMP. A key feature of our design brief was the separation of the administration and the investment and the insurance into 3 separate contracts. And that was to ensure that we got the best deal possible in relation to each of the major service components, but also to ensure that the trustee would ultimately be responsible for the investment policy, not the institution or the service provider. The brief also required 100% immediate vesting of the contributions in the name of each employee and full portability between employers. And of course, it was pretty brave of them to tender for this because everyone thought, well, you'll never be able to do it in the building industry. It's job by job, casual, day by day, day hire in many cases. You'll never be able to do it in the building industry. But in the end, a successful tender came from Colonial Mutual, who had a separate admin subsidiary. So successful, though, was the union campaign in its early days that the BLF was actually completely wrong-footed in its wage campaign. It completely misread the force of the other unions and the fire that caught on. And it fairly quickly changed its position to support the campaign. And once they did that, then it became truly devastating campaign. That added enormous weight and militancy and effectiveness to the campaign. It's important to remember, though, that the campaign had the virtue, or at least technically had the virtue, of allowing the militancy of the building unions to be released in a manner that did not breach the Commission's wage-fixing principles, nor the Accord, because the Commission itself had consistently stated, egged on by employer advocacy, that super was not an industrial matter. So they had no jurisdiction over it. Out of their own mouth, they had no jurisdiction. And just to divert for a moment here, so this Hamilton Knight case that they all touted and talked about, I think I was probably one of the few people who actually read it. People talked about it and said what it did do and it didn't do, but when you actually read it, what it was about was a seafarer's pension. And the case founded and got thrown out on the basis that there was no contract of employment between the employer and the seafarer because the seafarer was retired. So the case was dismissed as not an industrial matter. Of course, it's a completely different circumstance to the circumstance we were on about, which was getting employers to pay into an account on behalf of each employee. And so we had reasonable confidence that this could become an industrial matter in terms of the wage-fixing legislation. But the extent and the speed of the success of the campaign was to prove an ongoing problem for the Commission in terms of curbing the growth in total labour costs. And that, together with the persistent disputation around the choice of fund, because a lot of employers conceded, but then tried to say, but I've got, the brother-in-law's got a super fund over here, or AMP told me it'd be a good fund, this would be a good fund. And so there was often disputes about which fund the money would go into. And the unions were magnificent in their solidarity and steadfastness that it had to be an industry fund. So ultimately, this meant the Commission had to come to grips with actually regulating superannuation, because how do you keep a lid on labour costs if you don't? Because this is likely to go off across the whole of the workforce. And so after an unsuccessful attempt by the Confederation of Australian Industry to get it thrown out by the High Court, the Commission accepted that they would begin to arbitrate in the area, albeit to put a cap on it, 3%. So during 1984 and 1985, the ACTU sought to broaden the campaign. Construction-related unions, the electrical trades, the AWU, the metal workers, the iron workers, were organised under a scheme virtually identical to building union super, BUS. We were great for that BUS scheme. So we had Allied Union Super Trust then, AUST, and indeed I used to chair both these funds simultaneously. I'd have one set of unions down one side of the ACTU boardroom table, the other set down the other for efficiency. There was only be 1 or 2 items of difference on the agenda, and you deal with them separately, and otherwise it was one set of minutes. It was very, very efficient. We didn't have APRA in our life in those days. But it was efficient. The Transport Workers Union separately launched a high-profile campaign under the same ACTU guidelines. I was also active in that period in addressing meetings of state-based officials of the metal workers, iron workers, AWU and ETU, amongst others, leading to the establishment of MUST, which now MUST was initially Metal Unions Super Trust and later Manufacturing Unions Super Trust. And you can see how we were really truly in love with these acronyms at this time, but you'll appreciate that we showed some restraint. We didn't, for example, adopt the Printing Industry Super Trust or the Liquor Union Super Trust. We refrained from that. Anyway, the MUST scheme was, I chaired the MUST scheme in its early years, while the campaign went on company by company throughout the manufacturing industry, and ultimately we negotiated, the union and the ACTU negotiated with the Employer Association, the Metal Trades Industry Association, MTIA, to become part of the scheme. And that finally happened in 1988, and the scheme became and I must say, and once the employers did come on board, although we'd made a lot of gains and signed up a lot of employers without them, a lot more came in once the employers signed up and decided the inevitable was upon them and they should take part in it. And that scheme eventually became Superannuation Trust of Australia at that time, which today is part of the amalgamated Australian Super, the country's largest superannuation fund. The Australian Chamber of Manufacturers, in anticipation of events and not wanting to be left in a purely reactive position, also established a fund during this period, the Australian Retirement Fund, ARF. And they invited the ACTU to share power on the board of that fund. And we accepted that, even though it had very, very few members, because it did represent a break in employer ranks. And this was a very public campaign, a very public dispute, and it was, of immense psychological importance to take every break in ranks amongst employers to make that a winner. So that fund subsequently picked up much of the clothing, textile and footwear industry, and eventually expanded to be a leading fund in its own right before becoming the other half of the amalgamated Australian Super, when the employer associations amalgamated together, MTIA and ACM, to become today's Australian Industry Group. Other funds and campaigns established during that period included the health industry, HESTA, the liquor and allied trades, today the hospitality industry, mainly covered by Hostplus, timber, pulp and paper, furniture making, now collectively First Super, motor trades, MTAA Super, printing and allied trades and journalists and actors, now combined together as Media Super, the finance sector, which was later absorbed into Australian Super, as well as a number of state-based generic funds, including Sun Super in Queensland, Statewide Super in South Australia, West Scheme in Western Australia, which has now been absorbed by Australian Super, and Tasplan in Tassie. The Clerks Union and the Shoppies Union originally formed Care Super to cover clerical and retail employees. There goes the acronym again. Clerical and retail employees generally. However, the Retail Traders Association, presumably at the urging of Coles Myer and Woolworths, argued for a separate fund for the retail industry, and following deliberations by state tribunals and the accommodation of the SDA, the union on the Board of Rest, that became the industry fund for that industry. And that left Care Super as a bit of a stranded fund, but nevertheless Care Super's since continued to perform well and grown modestly. The growth of those sorts of funds, though, did require the variation of state-based awards. They were all covered by the relevant state awards, and that was completed in the latter stages of that same decade, the 80s. So, on any assessment, the ACTU coordinated campaign from 1983 through to the introduction of legislation in 91 for the establishment of universal compulsory super was an outstanding success, and it was devastating to many of its opponents. Official figures put the level of workforce coverage by the end of the 1980s at some 69%, up from 39% in 1983. But in fact, the coverage level was much higher than that. In the first place, official estimates were based on workforce sampling by way of questionnaire, whereas a very significant chunk of the workforce that had coverage or an entitlement to coverage by the end of the decade were actually still unaware of the fact. They were covered by state awards and so on. Effectively, every federal award had been varied to provide at least a minimum level of 3% contribution, and the state awards largely, as I said, were varied. And the state awards, remember, for the IR aficionados in the room, the state awards were common rule awards generally, so that meant they applied to everyone, not elsewhere included. They didn't just apply to the companies that had been served with the claims. They applied to everyone, not elsewhere included. So really everyone was covered to some basic level by the end of that decade. Secondly, in some of the more weakly unionised areas like the retail, they were only able to negotiate or get awarded a single contribution, an annual contribution in arrears. You know, people wondered why there was so much shenanigans in whether employers were paying or not. One contribution in arrears. So that meant that a lot of people wouldn't know for 18 months that they actually had super in a lot of cases, and of course there was a lot of non-compliance. So the figure was a lot higher than the official figures. But more importantly, I think, or just as importantly, the revolution in super coverage was qualitative as well as numerical. Virtually all of the growth in entitlements was fully vested in each individual, dismantling the typical requirements for long service with a single employer as a condition of entitlement, and opening the way for full portability between jobs. Discriminatory provisions were progressively removed. In 1983, only around 25% of working women had any access at all of any kind to super, and a similar figure for blue-collar workers. There was also a massive lift in coverage and cost effectiveness of death and disability insurance in those few years, and the accountability of the system was enhanced enormously with net returns published in a timely manner and statements posted to the home address of members rather than to business establishments, as was frequently the arrangement up until that time. So of course it wasn't simply the existence of pockets of militancy and some strong leadership and the CNA system. It wasn't just that. It was also a sense that the time was right. There was a sense that with an ageing demographic in Australia, the time was right. A sense that savings needed to replace consumption because of the imports and the effect on the balance of trade, so for economic reasons, and a sense of the massive inequality of all of the tax benefits, which were very substantial, much more than today. All of the tax benefits flowing to such a small group of the workforce, all of those things came together to mean that both wings of the labour movement, political and industrial, could get behind the move and formulate policy accordingly. The final thing to make, though, a sustainable system still wasn't in place, and that was not just to get a safety net legislation in place, but to get legislation which would ensure a continuous rise in the contribution level from 3%, because 3% would not, in the end, do the trick for retirement income. And that was achieved substantially through negotiation by my successor as Assistant Secretary at the ACTU, Ian Ross, together with Bill Keldy, with Paul Keating, who had the foresight to introduce a scale of compulsory employer contributions, which took 10 years, rose over a 10-year period to 9% over the 10 years to 2002. So that foresight has ensured that the system has become an indispensable part of Australia's economic and social policy, notwithstanding, the difficulty and pressure that unions are under these days, and the often and continuing hostile opposition from the Liberal Party. So rather than enumerating the ongoing political battles with the coalition, to protect and promote the progress of industry funds and indeed the super system as a whole, I now just want to turn briefly to some of the major initiatives of the movement itself to build upon the revolution initiated in the 80s. Obviously, the first thing is that had the movement at any point in its development been marred by the sorts of governance failures predicted by its many opponents and detractors, or if it had failed to produce competitive returns, then it would have been stopped dead in its tracks because it had many, many opponents. But in fact, exactly the opposite occurred. In the very early days, most of the newly created industry funds took advantage of the capital guaranteed products offered by major life companies. In part, that was because we knew that we couldn't afford a major market downturn in our formative years because of the political controversy around union involvement in super. But it was also promulgated by the intense competition between the life companies to obtain a stake in this new growing market. So at the height of that competition, those life companies were offering returns of between 16 and 17% per annum capital guaranteed. That is, guaranteed by the reserves that they'd built up over many years in those life companies. When the stock market crash of October 1987 occurred, a large chunk of the reserves of those life companies was in effect transferred to the accounts of industry fund members. And the outperformance story was well and truly begun. Subsequently, the returns being recorded by the property portfolios of the leading fund managers of the day, again, mainly life companies, at the end of the 1980s, were so substantial and indeed unrealistic, those returns, that it seemed only natural to lock them in by making withdrawals, and which we did. And so, for example, by the time I moved on from the ACTU and resigned as chair of the building construction industry and funds, at the end of 1989, we had property exposure down to about 1% or 1 or 2%. We'd got it right from 20% down, a very low number, because it was just so, the returns were so unrealistically high they were offering, it made sense to take those returns and bank them in effect. The ensuing property crash also provided a new once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with A-grade commercial properties that were often leased for 10 years or more to blue-chip tenants, including often government tenants, coming on the market at rental yields of 10% per annum or more, at a time when the 10-year bond rate was 7% per annum. So that represented a very clear arbitrage opportunity, which a number of industry funds began exploiting in the second half of the 90s through the newly formed collective vehicle of Industry Super Property Trust, initially managed by Westpac Financial Services. In a similar time frame, Industry Fund Services, IFS, in conjunction with Development Australia Fund was a vehicle negotiated between the ACTU, the Chamber of Manufacturers and AMP in 1989. It was in fact one of the last things I did before leaving the ACTU, and was largely a response to political mutterings from Canberra regarding the need to direct super investment into infrastructure. Many of you will be amused by the fact that history repeats. Anyway, that combination of DAF, DAF and IFS began leading a core group of industry funds into the unlisted asset space through private equity and infrastructure investments. The thesis being that funds that were growing strongly could afford to forego liquidity in their investments and by taking a long-term view, capture a premium rate of return for that lack of liquidity. So this became the nucleus of IFM Investors' Australian Infrastructure Fund, which today boasts a 20-year record of 12% per annum after tax and after fees. So for 20 years, 12% per annum after tax, after fees. And while IFM Investors itself has become a leading global funds manager, serving some 140 offshore institutional investor clients in addition to its 60-odd strong Australian institutional client base and managing more than 75 billion in assets. But perhaps the biggest outperformance story was the realisation in the mid-90s that the dominance of sales commission incentivised channels of our major competitors, that is the big banks, Bank Super and the life companies Super, the dominance of sales commission salesmen posing as financial planners, that was detracting so significantly from the long-term returns through ongoing and often opaque trailing commissions and inappropriate and conflicted advice, that this was a real opportunity to expose, but also to try and do something about. And so that realisation, we were slow to wake up really, but that realisation caused us to focus on the independent measurement of net benefit to the member. That is, don't listen to what anyone else says, measure what goes into the member's account. That might actually be the only thing that really counts in the end. And so we did that through really fostering the establishment of organisations like Super Ratings and others, or helping their development, and then subsequently launching a public awareness campaign, the most visible part of which is the continuing television campaign, which started with the Bernie Fraser ads, as we call them, and progressed through Compare the Pair. That particular one's a CBUS one. Compare the Pair, from Little Things, Big Things Grow, the Paul Kelly song, you might remember, to In Good Hands. Along the way, the funds sponsored a long and bitterly fought campaign to get legislative change, winding back payments by financial product providers to financial planners. A large measure of victory has been achieved, but it's still a work in progress. Indeed, Industry Super Australia and the Australian Institute of Superannuation Trustees, both products of collective action by industry super funds, have become arguably the most influential forces in super policy formation in Australia, while the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, ACTU, is a leader in corporate governance policy development and engagement with the nation's leading listed companies. So the average performance of industry super funds in terms of net member benefit continues to be comparatively strong. Average returns for the balanced default fund, where most of the compulsory money goes, for that category, for the last 5 years, the average returns were 8.35% per annum, compared to 7.16% per annum for retail funds, that is mainly the bank-owned funds. But nevertheless, there are a number of challenges and headwinds that are becoming apparent. The ongoing fallout from the global financial crisis will continue to depress absolute returns on average. Last financial year, the average industry fund returned 3.45%. That compared really well with the retail funds of 1.61%, but is still a relatively low absolute number. And this is certain, of course, to put more focus on costs, on the cost base and efficiency and so on of the system. And I'd have to say that while costs are falling, they're stable to falling slightly as a percentage of funds under management, they've risen alarmingly in absolute terms. If you just look at the sheer absolute aggregate numbers, in terms of total cost, it's risen quite a lot. Total annual operating, I'm not talking here about industry funds, I'm talking about the whole industry, but total annual operating expenses, excluding investment costs, because it's harder to measure and there's different type of investments. But the non-investment costs alone, for the median fund, rose 62% over the 6 years to June 2015. For the large fund category, the figure was 83%. Even when measured on a per member basis, the median non-investment cost of funds has risen from $98 per annum in financial year 2006 to $248 for financial year 2015. The large fund median, they've got a lower number, but the large fund median went from $101 to $156 per annum over the same period. And in the last 2 years, membership growth, I'm not sure about this year, but the previous 2 years, membership growth in all categories went actually slightly negative, reflecting an ageing demographic and a regulatory-driven clean-up of inactive accounts. So I'm not expecting that to be a permanent feature. But that pattern has not been significantly different for not-for-profit funds when compared to the rest of the sector, a similar pattern. So while it's also true that the larger funds have had the lion's share of growth in membership and assets, and therefore could be expected to have experienced some increase in total costs, it also appears that to some degree at least, their costs are rising simply because they can. That is, driven by internal management plans and ambitions, as well as by at times excessive regulatory change and unproductive regulatory oversight at times. Although I'd have to say that it could be argued that a fair bit of APRA's regulatory focus has been successful in imposing some industry rationalisation. Equally, and perhaps related to that, there is a clear threat to the culture that's been associated with the success of the industry funds to date. I've consistently argued that what lies behind their outperformance is at heart the motivation of the trustees and pioneering executives to put the fund members first. That is, the continuation of the original union spirit in creating the movement in the first place. If your goal is to maximise benefits for members, then you might actually go some way to achieving that, compared to if your goal is to achieve the maximum for some external shareholder group. But as the industry's grown, then of course so has the need to attract more resources and more diverse skills. Increasingly, management has passed into the hands of executives sourced from the financial services industry itself. So a key challenge for the trustees and executive leadership is to find ways to ensure that the original motivation and differentiation is maintained and built upon. If not, the form will disappear along with the substance. The mantra of all profits to members will not of itself assure outperformance. This will also require an ongoing willingness to innovate, to open up more private equity markets, to globalise their investment outlook, and to be prepared to take an appropriate degree of short-term risk in pursuit of long-term objectives. They will also have to build upon their economic relevance by continuing to advance more effective ways to develop and manage the nation's infrastructure and play a responsible leading role on social and environmental aspects of investment, as well as effectively carrying their story to the public and opinion leaders in an often challenging media environment. I think that's an understatement, challenging media environment. On the other hand, the ongoing representation of unions on the trustee boards of industry funds will ensure the spirit is there, but it will also ensure that a significant portion of the political class will continue to see them as a threat. So that means that mediocre long-term performance is simply not an option for this new mutual movement. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Garry, for a very interesting presentation on the history of the modern superannuation system and also your thoughts on the current issues as well as some of the future issues that the industry faces. Now I invite the audience, if you have any questions, to put them forward to Garry, but can I ask that you wait for microphones? There are two microphones, two roving microphones, and if you can use those. The lecture has, and this particular session is being recorded, and if you don't use the microphone, that won't be captured. Yes.
Can you give any indication as to why the non-investment costs have grown so rapidly?
The non-investment costs? Well, I think first of all, there's been an awful lot of regulatory development, shall we say. So, governments, of course, can't help but keep trying to improve the system, and in some cases, the changes have been deliberately actually aimed at making life hard for industry funds. I didn't do it, but I could, if someone asked the question, enumerate all of the legislative attacks that we've suffered. But So somewhat's been that. Then at the regulator level, there's been an awful lot of focus on procedure and process, on box ticking, more than on substance a lot of the time, on making sure that you've got all the correct policies in place, that you've ticked all the boxes on risk of one sort or another. There's been very little actual focus from the regulator on the actual net return. It's been a lot on the process, and that's led a sort of a bit of a culture of, let's both put on internal compliance officers and legal officers and so on, as well as have outside consultants of the best order and so on to help us guide through that. There is, I think, some sense also that, like all financial services, the product is somewhat opaque and the audience in market is somewhat disengaged from it. And therefore there is the ability to put prices up, to put costs up. Not putting prices up, but costs can go up, and no one sort of really notices or understands it. And there's a lot of misinformation in the marketplace, particularly spread by financial planners and our competitors about what you should really measure. And we've said consistently, measure what goes in the member's account. But not all the industry does that. So you get the ability for costs to drift upwards through lack of clarity about the product and the competitive position of the product. And so people do start to build empires, and if they can and where they can. And, the financial services industry generally is a sector where they can. Not just super, but financial services. Parts of financial services are much, much worse, as you probably know.
Gary, can I first make congratulations to the industry representative model about how they've managed to a great job of helping their workers accumulate financial assets over their working life. But I'd like to make two observations about the challenge that the system still hasn't developed. There's two unintended consequences that concern me here, and the first being at the macro level. If on the first chart you put the Australian house, it would have outstripped super. Okay? And the second so we're over-saving and people are dying and under-consuming and leaving their house to their kids. 90% of their assets at death are being passed on to their kids. They're under-consuming, they're eating baked beans, they're not going to the dentist, and they're sitting in their house. Watching the Australian cricket team lose, even worse. The second observation I make is at the bottom 25%, and if they've worked hard and been lucky, they've been actually lucky to get a house and then have Pillar 1 to retire to rely on, and they get to retirement age and they haven't got a lot of super, and they are increasingly going to pay off their mortgage with their super. So they're being actually forced to save, and haven't been given an opportunity to integrate their key asset into their both accumulation and decumulation phase, especially their accumulation phase, when 70% of them are at home living on less than $35,000 a year when they've got a house worth over $600,000. And that's not acting in the member's interest.
Well, I think you have nailed an important social policy area for sure. I don't accept the argument that it's an alternative. I think there's a lot of things. If you say, well, you can take your money out of super for this, that or the other, pretty soon there won't be any money left in super because someone's always got another priority. Secondly, I would say that the home ownership position has already, of course, a very substantial tax incentive through absence of capital gains on ownership of the family. But worse still, investors and speculators have a massive incentive. It's called negative gearing. And that forces the price of housing up for everyone. And that's crazy. It is just a crazy policy. So I think a comprehensive solution would definitely deal housing into it. I mean, super deals with two things. It deals with longevity risk, right, which is a very big reality, if you want to, it's a perverse way to talk about it, but longevity risk, and it deals with a large part of health costs, because remember, most health costs occur in the later stages of life. And to rob that Peter to pay the other Paul, I don't think makes sense, but to integrate in some way better would be a very good thing. And I've long held the view, and there are in fact some tentative signs from parts of the industry fund movement now, that we should address precisely that issue about shared equity and reverse mortgages and actually start to do something about that. I don't support opening up the system for withdrawals, the housing, because after the house it'll be the car and the fridge. And you know, while certain politicians would love to get rid of that system and leave everyone to their own individual devices, it's simply a disaster, a recipe for disaster, as most of the countries of the world are now finding out. Apart from a handful of European countries, they're now finding that out. So I do think the super industry should do a much better job on addressing, using their now considerable assets and wealth on targeting ways to help the housing industry and turning residential property into an investable asset class along the way. I think shared equity, reverse mortgage are two of those ways.
Just have one more.
One more question.
Yeah, just one more.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. The first graph you showed demonstrated that the collective assets in the super industry outstrip GDP and even the size of the ASX. Now, I'm wondering whether the size of that accumulated savings doesn't convey a certain responsibility to the whole industry on the development of Australian infrastructure and even innovative policy. So the industry makes very large decisions for the way that this country goes in terms of real estate development, in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of which enterprises and assets are being supported. How does that, can that be connected with the imperative to deliver returns?
Yeah, well, that's absolutely a very important issue that you've raised, and one we've been banging on about for quite a while ourselves. It is apparent, and it's been apparent for many, many years, that not just Australia, but a number of, particularly the developed countries, need to, and for that matter, less developed countries, need to address infrastructure spending in a very major way, to upgrade infrastructure, to make it environmentally friendly for the future, environment proof, if you like, climate proof for the future, and much more efficient and modern. That's clear. It's also clear we need job stimulus. It's also clear that there's an awful lot of pressure on governments not to run their deficits up too high. Now, you know, there is a very simple way this can be tackled, and it is about channeling the massive amounts of money, not just in our super system, but in sovereign funds around the world, into that task of building, not spending on consumption, building, investing in the future, investing in productive infrastructure, creating short-term jobs which make future jobs more productive. Absolutely on side with it. It doesn't actually require any tax incentive. Everyone keeps saying, oh, we'll come up with a tax incentive, a special bond. Absolute nonsense. What it requires is enough political attention span and leadership to make the projects happen. You know, to actually allow, if need be, recycle existing assets, sell them to us and put those funds into building new things. That's been done recently in New South Wales, and we've been a central part of that. And it will be done here in Victoria too, to a degree. But the extent of it is inadequate. In the States, it's shameful. It is shameful that you go to the island that harbours Wall Street and you drive through tunnels which look like bomb shelters, bombed out bomb shelters, look like Second World War bomb shelters, and you're in traffic that just doesn't move. And you cross bridges which may crack any time. So I couldn't agree more. There is a clear way forward. We try to encourage dialogue with governments to do it, but we can't lead that on our own. Infrastructure development cannot be done by the private sector alone. It needs government leadership. Even when there's an obvious economic return, it still needs government facilitation because there's regulations, state, local, federal, environmental impact, all the things that need to be organised politically. So what we need to do is get politicians to have sufficient attention span to drive the infrastructure program forward. And we will be there. We'll be there at the table. We will ensure that every superannuation member in this country gets a chance to be part of that. But we have to have the projects, the things we can invest in. We can't invent them.
Garry, it's been 33 years since this started. And this is the first time I've heard this remarkable story told in such detail and full. And it's such a significant part of this country's history. It's wonderful that this story's finally been told. How proud do you feel of your role, and who else deserves recognition for such an amazing result for the workers and ultimately for this country?
You mean apart from you as a former ACTU and fiscal? Yeah, as you can tell, I am known to the questioner. So, look, the short answer is, Chris, we've all been very busy, you know. So you can't tell a story when you're making it. But look, I think that this is a story really about initially a handful of union leaders, you know, who really went out on a limb. And they were militant. They were not regarded as heroes in their day. I can assure you, they were regarded as scary people, and doing things that were, you know, vaguely not quite nice. And perhaps, you know, are you sure this is legal? You know, that was the atmosphere, and that's how most progress has been made for working people, in my opinion. You know, and so I wish it were otherwise. I wish that everything could be achieved through rational discussion and debate, but often it can't. And so I give the main credit really to the pioneering union people, and then of course to all the many people who came on board. I mean, the employers did come on board in many cases in a very good way later, and so did the service providers. And we've changed the service provider industry, but they've also taught us too. You know, so I don't think it's not about credit, but it is about understanding history, and it's about defending what you've achieved for the future, because we still have attacks every year. There is some new device comes out of a certain part of the coalition that is either disguised or undisguised attempt to kill the industry funds. Every year we've had that every year since 1984. So, and some of it's been absolutely blatant. But so that fight will continue.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your questions, and I know that there were many other hands that went up, but we have run out of time, so we'll bring this lecture to a conclusion. Well, Garry, thank you very much. This is a small token of our appreciation.
I will declare that.
You